Welcome to the reInvent Nuclear Security series, where this session we're going to be looking at developing the next generation of innovators. I'm Peter Leyden, I'm the founder of reInventors, and I'm welcoming the community to this halfway mark. We're halfway now through the series. So far in this series, we've basically looked at game-changing technologies that might really make an impact on the nuclear proliferation and arms control space in the coming decades. We've looked at how the National Nuclear Weapons Labs might be repurposed to new challenges and how that might affect the space in the coming decades. We've looked at how to broaden the sense of partnership, like beyond the kind of core folks who have been in the field for decades here. How can we actually move beyond that and get many more people involved in actually lowering the risk of a nuclear bomb going off and ultimately helping eradicate these over time. And like I say, this week we're going to be looking at how do we recruit and retain the next generation of innovators to work into this space. And that's where we're going to go today. Now, our partners in this, we've been fortunate to be our partners in this, is N-Square. It's a new organization. It's backed by 5 of the leading peace and security foundations really in the world. These are the MacArthur Foundation, it's the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, it's the Plowshares Fund, it's the Skoll Global Threats Fund, and it's also the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And what I'm going to do now is actually turn over this roundtable to Carl Robichaux, who's actually a program director in this peace and security program for the Carnegie Corporation. And he's going to tee up the problem. What is the problem in this space we're going to be working on today, and hopefully coming up with some interesting solutions. So Carl, you want to take it?
Thanks. Hi, everyone. As Peter said, my name is Carl Robichaux, and I'm a program officer at the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And we fund independent analysis, policy-relevant research and outreach, and Track 2 diplomacy focused on reducing the nuclear threat. And one problem that we face at Carnegie, and that I know a lot of my peer foundation officers face, is that people are aware of the nuclear threat only in very narrow terms. You know, a lot of people are concerned about Iran acquiring nuclear weapons, or a few of them are concerned about North Korea's nuclear program or about nuclear terrorism. But very few people are aware that there are 16,000 nuclear weapons in the world, and many of them are on high alert. As we've seen with the US-Russia relationship in crisis and the US-China relationship remaining very tense, there's just very little room for error. And what we've also seen are a couple other troubling dynamics. The globalization process has made it easier to acquire dual-use nuclear technologies. We've seen the emergence of proliferation networks like the AQCON network, and that has resulted in the barriers to acquiring nuclear weapons, they've been reduced. And at the same time, the benefits to acquiring nuclear weapons have in some ways increased as more and more countries rely on nuclear weapons to counterbalance what they see as their conventional weakness in the face of high-precision, advanced conventional weaponry that's possessed by many states. So we are now at a point where we've had nuclear weapons for about 70 years, and a lot of people see the threat as fundamentally over. But 70 years is not a long time. It's really a dot on the timeline of human history. And the technology of these weapons, whether or not the weapons are with us indefinitely, the technology will be with us indefinitely. And we know that in those first 70 years, we had a number of close calls. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet false alarms of 1983, and there were many other accidents and miscommunications and the failure of complex systems that put us right on the brink of nuclear war. And my question is, will we survive another 70 years as a civilization? Will we survive another 700 years unless we get a hold of this technology and rein it in? And yet, it doesn't seem to me that the issue of the nuclear threat really resonates with young people today. And what we've seen how climate change and the human rights movement have drawn on the energy and the talent of young entrepreneurs in harnessing new technologies. And they're transforming the energy and information landscape and the way we communicate about issues that we care about and how we take political action. But we're not seeing the same level of interest on what, in my view, is arguably the greatest threat to human civilization. nuclear issues are seen as our parents' challenge, when in fact they are our challenge, and they are our children's challenge, and most likely they'll be our grandchildren's challenge. And one of our challenges as a foundation is to try to harness the energy and the intellectual horsepower of citizens in addressing this threat. And during the Cold War, we were able to do that. Governments were able to do that. They were able to draw in some of the world's best and brightest minds, both in political science and in the physical sciences. And it led to some incredible innovations in the way that we understand the world and in the way that we think about political processes. But today, it's really hard for the national labs to find talented people who want to dedicate a significant portion of their lives to nuclear risk reduction. And it's really hard in the non-governmental research sector and the advocacy space. These are places that are still predominantly dominated by the people who are working on the issues in the 80s and the 90s. And they tend to be white men in their 50s and 60s, many in their 70s and 80s, who have deep expertise on this issue and who know what's going to work and what's not going to work. Except I don't think they really do know what's going to work and what's not going to work, because the problem they were facing was quite different than the problem we were facing today. And the tools that we have at our disposal are quite different today than what we had 20 or 30 years ago. And I don't think we want to replicate these old institutions and have the same people using the same tools and the same problems. Instead, I think that we want to tap in to some of the new skill sets that are available to address today's problems, which are quite different, including terrorist networks and these new global proliferation networks that weren't around in the same way in the past. So I think that there is some really incredible work being done today at the margins of the nuclear security space in terms of preventing nuclear proliferation and nuclear terrorism, and taking advantage of some novel technologies, from remote sensing and crowdsourcing to structured data analysis and virtual reality. One of the things I like to think about is how the technologies that you can access for free using Google Earth. Until about 20 or 30 years ago, those technologies were only available to spy agencies who had billion-dollar budgets, and now they're available to average citizens. And the types of commercial satellite imagery that's coming down the line is going to dwarf those capabilities. The ability, the precision and the cost of these small satellites is pretty remarkable. And in my view, it's not just about the information coming in. The killer app is really being able to fuse that data from these different sources and to make sense of it in a timely way. And we need people with these types of skills. And right now, there are not too many of them in the community. There are a few, and they're doing pretty remarkable work, but we need more of them. And millennials come to the table with many of these skills, but we face a real structural impediment to bringing them in and finding places for them within the community. One thing I think we need to think about is that careers are going to take a different trajectory than they once did. To make a difference on this issue, you don't need people who are going to come in and dedicate their entire lives to this issue. You need people who can cross disciplinary lines, who are going to come in and come out, will cross-pollinate, and you don't need a massive number of talented people. A few hundred individuals with the right skills can make a tremendous difference in this space. And finding those individuals and empowering them is one of the things that we try to do at Carnegie and that my peer foundations try to do. And we would love to get more of your thoughts on how we can do that better. And I'll leave with one story, which is something of a success, which is that over the past couple years, the Stanton Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, and the Carnegie Corporation of New York have really focused on revitalizing the next generation within the academic community, especially in the political science space, as well as in history and some of the physical sciences. And there's been a tremendous inflow of new people and new energy focused on the problems of proliferation, deterrence, and nuclear security. And it's become sort of a second golden age for nuclear scholarship in the social sciences. And these young professors are in turn training the next generation. And unfortunately, we haven't seen a parallel renaissance in the physical sciences, or especially in the NGO sector. But I think that's what we really need to see if we're going to see a movement to seriously address these threats. So I look forward to continuing the conversation. But Peter, maybe you and Erica could take it from here.
Great. Thanks so much, Carl. I'll go ahead and jump in and say, first of all, thanks for that great introduction. And one of the things we know is that innovation tends to flourish at the intersection between cultures and domains and disciplines. Some people in the world call this the Medici effect. And in fact, there's a famous head of Google's people department, Laszlo Bock, who talks about the importance of different domains clashing, combining, and transferring so that ideas move from one field to another and form a multitude of new ideas. And I wanted to mention that because I think the folks we have in this episode today represent that kind of Medici effect because they're coming at this conversation from such divergent places. So with that, I'd like everybody to take a couple minutes and introduce themselves, get a sense of who's here at the table, and then we'll jump into the conversation. So Anna, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Ewan, and then to Mimi for introductions.
Can you hear me? Hello, everyone. This is I'm Anna Erickson from Georgia Tech and Atlanta, Georgia, and I represent assistant professors in nuclear science and engineering. I have 3 degrees in nuclear science and engineering. My PhD was done at MIT. And I studied precisely nuclear security and non-proliferation in terms of detecting special nuclear materials being transported across the borders, physical methods of doing that, and any political implications that could happen. And in my research group, we're very heavy on non-proliferation by design and nuclear material search and methods of discovering illicit activities.
Okay, that's great. Thanks so much for being with us, Anna. And how about you, Ewan, and Mimi, and then we'll go to Moritz.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ewan Foster. I'm a British scholarship student at Harvard College. The reason I'm here is not to give an expert opinion on nuclear strategy or tactics, but to represent the subject populace, if you will, of today's debate, in that we are the young, not entirely inadequate, or incapable graduates of the top universities who are interested in not only civilian but geopolitical careers. My personal experiences that I think will help contribute to this debate are, firstly, I've worked with top diplomats and military leaders to propose government policies in both defense and the civilian sector in my country, in the UK. And secondly, I founded and I run a group of some of the more sharper and fascinated Harvard students who are interested in engaging not only in public or private ventures, but also in grand strategy at a later level in their lives. So I think that, to go back to Carl's point, I think that the young and capable students really are going to dip in and out of various careers, and I think the more we can foster that, the more progress that we can make.
Thanks, Ewan. Thanks for being with us. Mimi.
Hi, I'm Mimi Ito. I'm a professor at the University of California, Irvine, and I'm a cultural anthropologist. And my area of study is digital youth culture. So I hang out with kids on the internet and watch them play video games and organize with social media. So I think I'm in this conversation to talk about how young people are learning and connecting differently these days.
That's exactly right. And in fact, we're going to come to you with some questions about that in just a minute. Let's go to Moritz and then Becca.
Hi, I'm Moritz Kutt, and I'm a PhD candidate in Darmstadt, Germany. And my topic of research is how open source software could help nuclear disarmament and the non-proliferation efforts. And I'm in this conversation because I think, of course, a PhD project somehow has to be innovative. I hope it is in some sense. I also did some side projects at the periphery, so I tried to develop for Google Glass, a wearable device, to make it usable for nuclear safety and security applications.
Perfect. Thank you, Becca. And then we'll come around to Susanna.
Hi there, I'm Becca Cousins. I'm the program director for the NextGen Initiative at an organization called BASIC, which is a transatlantic think tank focused on nuclear weapons issues. Just to give a quick overview of what the NextGen Initiative is, it's essentially an attempt to create a platform for a kind of a global cross-issue conversation that kind of explores the substantive connections between nuclear issues and other global challenges. It's aimed specifically at the emerging policymakers, and it's intended to be a really two-way conversation to kind of explore not just how to get emerging policymakers involved in these questions, but really to understand why they would get involved. So we've carried out a number of focus groups with students in the US and the UK and young professionals, and tried to have conversations with them about their drivers and their motivations and their interests and where nuclear fits in that. So I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this discussion today, and you know, I'll be drawing from our conclusions from those focus groups quite heavily as we go through the discussion. So
that's great. And then finally we have Susanna.
Hello. Yes, I'm Susanna Pollock, and I head up partnerships for an organization called Games for Change. I feel a little bit like the outlier in the group, but hopefully that'll be a good thing. We work a lot with organizations and developers who recognize the power that digital games can have in serving humanitarian educational efforts. And we often act as a bridge between these two sectors as we see the powerful nature that digital games and interactive connection can have in educating, change social behavior, and raise awareness around some very important issues that affect us today.
Well, that's perfect, and I'm going to come right back to you in just a second, Susanna, because what I'd like to do is start by having Mimi and Susanna, first of all, in terms of being an outlier, that's exactly why you're here, and of course, on some level, I think it's why N Square was started, so that we could bring new voices to this conversation. So you're in good company, I think. So let's start out by looking at the broader context here. Carl framed up some challenges for us about which he described as structural impediments for finding pathways for new young people to make their careers in nuclear security, non-proliferation, disarmament affairs. But let's talk about who those folks are likely to be. Mimi, you have done a tremendous amount of research into the lives of young people who are learning in classrooms and in informal learning environments very differently from the way that any of us over the age of 50 experienced school. So those folks, I think it's fair to say, will come to any career that they have with certain expectations and habits of minds and ways of working that are somewhat different from our own. So can you help us paint a picture for what it means as a millennial to come into the workplace after experiences like those?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting hearing Carl's framing about the challenges of balancing or mediating between the more institutionalized and long-standing professional networks and organizations and tapping into this sort of bubbling cauldron of networked innovation and creativity. And I think this is exactly what we're seeing in young people's lives, is that, you know, the institutional accountabilities around learning and careers and all of those are still in place, right? I think for ambitious and successful young people, in many ways, the race towards achievement, that arms race, has, to use a metaphor of the moment, is getting worse, right? So what it takes to get into the good university, go up that next rung of the ladder, is in many ways much more competitive and challenging than when I was trying to get into school, for example. But on the other hand, there's this total culture clash between that traditional ladder and what they're doing in their informal learning, in their everyday lives, when they're interested in something, pursuing a passion, or they're activists or trying to organize around causes. And that's happening in this networked ecosystem where learning is demand-driven, it's learner-centered, they have a very strong feeling of agency and voice, a sense of being able to work in a more peer-based, flatter structure for getting things done. And I think it's a very interesting moment that we're asking young people in some ways to do all of the traditional stuff, but it's not really keyed into this environment of complete abundance of information and social connectivity that they're actually growing up in. So I think a lot of the challenges that you're facing in your sector parallel, this bigger culture clash between the networked ways of doing things and the institutionalized ways of doing things. I see a lot of parallels in what we're seeing from the point of view of young people. And I think what seems to be some of the premise of the conversation here today is that how can we tap into that more learner-driven, youth-driven, activated kind of learning, innovation, organizing, rather than relying on that traditional pipeline, and how can we make the issue of nuclear arms something that is captivating and interesting and genuinely engaging to young people at the level of, say, hang out with young people, they care about things like LGBTQ rights are sort of a civil rights issue of the day, climate change, immigrant rights. These are things that have really captivated young people. I think there's been a resurgence in some of the long-standing social justice issues around the police brutality cases. Groups like the Dreamers, for example. These are examples of issues that have really captivated young people because they feel a sense of affinity and identity. And so I'm really curious to hear from the experts in the field what you think those touch points can be for nuclear issues with the younger generation.
So you bring up such important points, Mimi, in particular at the end there in your comments about what it's going to take to captivate young people or give them a sense of personal identity or identification with the nuclear security problematic. But I wonder for just a second, before we go to that, if you could go a little bit deeper on the specifics of how young adults are collaborating and, for instance, doing research. How is that different potentially from the people who are employing them in this sector who have more conventional, traditional backgrounds?
Yeah, so I think once you're in that space of the more youth and interest-driven kind of learning and organizing, then what you're seeing is a much more exchange, sharing, collaboration at the peer-to-peer level. That there's joint problem solving, a sense of shared purpose and mission that drives kids doing things together, which is very different from that sort of competitive achievement dynamic that you're seeing in the more institutionalized ways of getting ahead. And that's where, it's interesting because this context of abundance means that there's so much that can capture attention right now, which can be both good and bad. So if you have a very strong sense of affinity, peer networks, and so on, then the power in that is unbelievable. But you have to be recruited and enlisted and feel like you belong and are making a difference, have a genuine contribution to make. It can't be something that's sort of mandated from the top down in order to tap into that dynamic. And it also means, this ecosystem also means it's really a lot easier for young people to disengage too, because there's so many other fun and interesting things and things you can do with people who you really connect with and care about, and that sense of belonging and being with a group of people who are really your people is incredibly motivating and engaging, and that group could just as much be some amazing social cause. It is, just hang out with your friends too. So I think that it's really throwing a new challenge into the laps of people who are, trying to cultivate young people and their interests and learning or engagement in social and political issues, is that we can't just sort of dictate what those issues are. You know, we have to have genuine involvement and engagement, and give up a lot of ownership of the agenda along the way.
So, Susanna, I think that there's a link here that I hope you're going to help me make. So, Susanna, you are in contact with a network of 12,000 game developers, and the folks that you're working with have decided that they want to take their game development chops and work on social issues. So, what can we learn from them, and how would you respond to Mimi's description of the characteristics of the folks who are entering the workforce? Do you notice anything in common with this network of gamers that you work with?
Well, it's kind of interesting that our network of gamers and game developers tend to be in the independent sector. And I think that actually does speak to, an interest for young people, millennials, to kind of find their own path and find and connect with things that are important to them, rather than entering into a big system or corporation as a traditional, path that they would normally have to go. I think another thing about our community when it comes to those who are making or who are attracted to this sector is that they consider themselves artists first and foremost, the creative entity. They aren't necessarily content experts, and they don't feel as if they need to become content experts. I think that which makes them great partners in this kind of initiative, in that they often are either hired by an NGO or organization or foundation, or seek out content experts in that way to help realize a game or a story or a way to connect with audiences on a subject area that they're very passionate about. So in some ways, I think they're excellent collaborators and an excellent community to reach out to when thinking about how to connect with broader audiences. I mean, part of this challenge is not only is to find the next generation of innovators who want to enter this field, but also how to raise awareness around this issue as broadly as possible, so it does become a meaningful conversation that happens throughout the generation or demographic. And I think the young people and the artists, as they want to personalize this, and I think that's probably the key. And Mimi talked about this, is they want that not only the creators but the audiences want to feel like they're part of something meaningful. They want to belong. And a lot of these young artists and game developers are making content that speaks to them directly, and finding partners that can help them make that experience as real as possible. The other end of the spectrum is really, and our community also does include a few of this, is the commercial game developers, which I don't think they should be excluded either from the conversation, because they already are reaching mass audiences and can be an interesting partner for social issues and causes, and helping address these in kind of a mass media kind of way. And there are more of those partners who are turning to Games for Change in our community, because they're beginning to recognize that that the power of such a strong engagement experience can be. And there are a few, we can talk about that later, but there are a few that are touching on these issues.
That's great. We'll certainly come back to some of those topics, Susanna, about the game community. But I think there's some interesting strands that we want to build on here. One is around how to captivate young adults in the ways that you described, Mimi. How to create in a career path a personally meaningful set of experiences, and also how to create a sense of identification and belonging, all of which seem important to the folks that you've been describing so far. And so, Becca, I'm going to turn to you here and thinking about the work you're doing with BASIC on Next Gen Innovators, and ask what all this means to you as you think about the challenges for recruiting young adults into this sector. What are you thinking?
Sure. So I should just to be clear, you know, the people that we've been working with through the Next Generation Initiative with BASIC have been emerging policymakers, so people who are actively engaged in policy issues. And they've come from all different backgrounds, you know, ranging from interest in environmental issues to interest in security and defense to global economy issues. And what was clear to us from the outset is that nuclear doesn't feature very high on that list. So 25% of the people we spoke to said we're interested in nuclear as kind of a standalone issue. 51% said we're interested where it kind of interacts with another issue that we might be interested in. And I think that's a really interesting point to think about, that, you know, from my experience in the nuclear field, and I should also say that my career background hasn't been entirely nuclear, so I did broad foreign policy for 10 years and have worked in the nuclear space for just 2. And one of the things that's really striking for me is how siloed that discussion can be. And I think that is kind of one of the things that we might want to think about, is how do you actually connect nuclear weapons issues and nuclear security with other questions that are on people's minds already. And then just to pick up on a couple of other points that Mimi and Susanna raised, that, you know, the way that emerging policymakers are working is, you know, they have a strong sense of agency and voice, as Mimi said, and they're interested in getting things done. The message that we got back from the focus groups that we ran was that actually it's very difficult to understand what the impact is that they can have in the nuclear space. So what are the actions that they can take beyond committing an entire career to nuclear that actually will have an impact? So, you know, there's very much an all or nothing feeling about it. You know, you have to either commit everything, go all in, or, you know, don't do anything at all. And I think maybe Ewan has something more to say about that later. But you know, these are some of the things that we've come across, that kind of relevance to daily life. How do we connect these issues together, and the sense that we really want to make an impact? How do we go about doing that? So those are some of the things that I think we might want to think about in more depth.
Well, you've teed it up for Ewan with a good question. So I think let's go to you, Ewan. Curious to hear you discuss, as a policy student, the degree to which you feel empowered to engage with the nuclear discussion, and if you do, why, and if you don't, tell us about that too.
That's a great question. So it's a very hard one for students in my kind of position to get into at all. And I think Becca alludes to the really central point, in that people see it as a kind of all or nothing. You're in for the long run career, or you're not. I've done previous kind of defense proposals, and even things on the periphery of high-tech weapons, I've had to submit them through people who've been in the field for decades, just to get anyone to really look at them and read them. So I think that's a bit off-putting for young policymakers from the outset. I think regarding nuclear weapons particularly, people see it as, if I go and, you know, begin to look at nuclear weapons, or take an interest, or make a proposal, if that goes well, or if, you know, someone considers me to be worthy of my work to be worthy of reading, they'll kind of shuffle you into that department, and that will be your area of expertise henceforth. And then you really won't be able to kind of get into any other areas that might still tickle your fancy. So a lot of students at Harvard, especially my year, are very interested in doing international development work. That's the buzzword right now. That's all. You know, go to somewhere in the developing world and try your hand at it, because you can see results straight away. That's about creating good. Whereas with nuclear policy, they see it as kind of, hey, it's just averting bad. So, you know, there's really not much you can get out of it in terms of personal satisfaction, immediate reward. And then there's also the idea that, yes, you'll be shuffled away into some backroom part of the Foreign Office. And yes, I suppose that's really the gist of it, is that we don't really see it as something you can dabble in. It's a commit or don't bother touching it kind of affair.
So I'm going to ask you to talk just a little bit more about this, Ewan. Carl said something in his opening remarks about how the nature of careers are changing. And I think we've all seen some of the things that go around the internet about a person of your age. Ewan can expect to have, I don't know, 172 jobs by the time they're 50. I don't know. I won't remember the numbers. But that is obviously very different from the kind of career experience that many of us over the age of 50 have had.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about what you and your peers expect as you go into your careers. What are you looking for? What do you hope for?
Right. Well, I think there's two prongs to this argument. First of all, I think the private sector is far ahead of the public sector in terms of attracting us into these kind of mini career opportunities. So, you know, banks and investment, you know, tycoons will come into Harvard and say, look, you can come work with us for 3 years, 5 years, sign a contract for 2 years, just give us a little bit of your time, you can learn so much, and then you can move on. It's all about kind of, it looks great on the resume, you can take it on and build from there. Whereas a public servant will come in and it's kind of seen as, it's something very inspiring, it's very ennobling, but it's considered a kind of a crusade, and a crusade is not something you dip in and dip out of and, you know, you go and start your own company after that. It's a kind of long-term thing. And I think the second point is that one great thing about being at Harvard is that we're blessed that I, you know, for instance, on Monday I just dipped into a class with Ambassador Burns, and they were, you know, debating Russia and NATO's encroachment policy and things like that. That's very inspiring, and that does help me get interested in the field. I think that's something that needs to happen a lot more. I think other schools are not so lucky as to have former ambassadors come and teach them and get riled up and, you know, be inspirational. So I think that if we were able to get foreign officers to give more permission and encourage, you know, former civil servants, former nuclear security specialists to go to graduation speeches, to go to just various universities and schools and try and inspire students, I think that they would compete a little bit better with the big banks and the big NGOs and attractive things like that.
That's very now. So we've heard from you and your experience at Harvard, and now I'm going to go to Europe, to Moritz, who's at the University of Darmstadt. And you have found your way, Moritz, into doing this work. So I'm kind of curious how all this conversation resonates with you. Maybe you could talk a little bit, tell us some stories about your own experience as somebody who has done more than dipping your toe into the nuclear security field. You have made a commitment. So tell us about that. How did you get there, and what does this conversation leave you thinking about?
So it's basically similar to the US perspective. As far as I learned, and I met many people there, the scene here for young academics to become whatever it is, a nuclear specialist, either in a technical field, this is basically my experience, I'm a physicist mainly, but also in the policy field. It's really difficult to envision, you know, in my lifetime, the lifetime of engagement with the nuclear field. And there's not many job opportunities that come directly, and it's much easier to work in many different fields. You can, as a technical person, it seems much more likely to work for a renewable company, to develop wind turbines, or to develop solar cells or electric cars, or develop new devices for computers, new cell phones, smartwatches, whatever, instead of going to the nuclear field, where in fact, even if you know about it, which not everybody does, so many of my peers actually, if I tell them there's still some 20 tactical nuclear weapons in Germany, they say, this is not true, we didn't know about this, and even these simple facts are not in the knowledge anymore. But so it's not only this, but also that if they know about this, there has not been much progress over the last decades, actually, if you look at it. Of course, we got down in numbers, and the Cold War ended, but basically we are there where we were when this all started in 45, that some states have nuclear weapons and they threaten each other and other states to use them, and we do not really know how we can deal with this problem, how we can actually convince them to get rid of the nuclear weapons. And an additional issue I see is that also, even if people have solutions, and people sort of solutions I did during my research, it's not clear how they can actually be politically feasible. And on the other hand, there are some political feasible ideas, that have no technological backing. And then that also leads to this discrepancy of people not trying to go this career path.
So Moritz, I wonder if you could give us some advice. What would it take for the sector to keep someone like you? Let's say not for the rest of your life, but what would it take to entice you to give us the next 5 to 7 years, for instance, of your professional life? What would need to be true for you?
I think some openness. That is actually something I'm missing. So I'm developing open source software basically because before I used export controlled software and I could not share the results I produced with all other people I actually met. So I decided that open source software, where I share the source code and my software with others, is helpful in this sense. And I learned this from the computer science community, or the hacker community. Hacker being the good guy, not the person hacking into a network or a bank, but the person actually trying to play with technology and trying to improve technology, either hardware or software. They had this idea of open source software 20 years ago, or even earlier. And I took this over to the nuclear field and said, if we want to work on nuclear disarmament, we need to share some information. Of course, I know many of you, or most of you, are US-based. There's always the issue of national security and classified information. But at some point, this makes it unattractive to actually engage with people, because I cannot talk about every issue to them, or at least they cannot talk to every issue with me. I think some information should be shared, or more information should be shared. More information at least relevant to the goal of disarmament could be shared.
Okay, so that is really helpful. There are so many things to come back to, Moritz. I want to make sure we come back in a few minutes to this conversation about the culture of hacking. So I'll be back to you in a moment. But first I want to come to Anna. Anna, you represent exactly the kind of person we're describing when we talk about a next generation innovator. And so I'm curious to know, from where you now sit, how you see the sector changing with the participation of new talent, with millennials joining the sector. What do those changes begin to look like?
So I'm in an interesting position at the university, being in a field that is probably the most conservative out of most fields. If you look at our curriculum, we're not that different what we were 20, 30 years ago in terms of what we teach to our students. But the demand is no longer at the same subjects. As we can see that, as we see young people entering the field, how do we attract them? And I think we've heard a couple of interesting points today. And the most important thing is make nuclear field a dynamic field, the one that adapts to the new technology, and not only the open technology, but also how we see the science and engineering. And what we're trying to do is make both science and engineering that we teach to our students more interdisciplinary. A lot of research that we approach anymore, we try to involve other departments, people that know nothing about nuclear after working with our students or taking the classes that we try to offer to a wider, broader audience, now understand what we face in terms of the issues. And of course, it cannot be understated that the nuclear usually finds itself in a circle that cannot be resolved. It's either technology that is impossible that's proposed, that's politically accepted, or the other way. If the technology is possible, then it's politically unacceptable for the most part. So what do? I think nuclear needs to change, nuclear as a field, to attract young people, and the way to change it is to bring more dynamics into the field. I think the great way to do it is the startup companies that we see. The students are excited that we can now create a technology that we can actually build. So I come from I stand between the two generations almost. I'm not really a millennial, but I'm not really 50, so I'm somewhere in the middle. And my generation is known as generation of paper reactors. We studied engineering. I went to engineering, nuclear engineering, when I was 17. So from day one, it was nuclear. I've never studied anything else in my life. Studied knowing that nothing potentially will be built again in terms of new reactor plants. Well, how do we drive new people in now? Things are changing. We're building more, but of course we're aware of the issues of nuclear security and non-proliferation. So one of the things that we try to plant in our students' mind from the inception is start thinking about engineering of the new systems as proliferation-resistant systems. Don't rely on necessarily political and policy solutions only. Rely on self-protection. As much as we want to get rid of the nuclear weapons, it's probably not going to happen in my lifetime. There's too much political weight that is being placed on them. So as engineers and scientists, we try to approach it from a different position. And that would be make it difficult, make it unattractive, and start from the beginning. Teach students from the beginning how to do that.
Wow, so very interesting, Anna. So you've brought up quite a few things. Mimi, I think you wanted to jump in on one of them, and Moritz, I think, really began this, which is about the culture of openness. But I just want to also knit together a few threads. So Anna, you talked about the importance of engineering culture, the importance of entrepreneurship as a motivator or an incentive for people who are growing up with the idea that it's really important to make your mark, making something, doing something in the world potentially for commercial application. And then there was a strand just for Moritz and you both, Anna, about openness. So Mimi, what did you want to jump in and talk about?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting just hearing from folks in the field about how there is this sense that there's a really high barrier to entry, that it's a very intensely professionalized kind of field that you're either in or you're out of, and I think that is sort of from the outside the perception that, you know, it is a set of issues that are being decided by a certain set of power elites or people who are specialists in the field, and I think that is a really interesting challenge to say what does it take to create a sense of openness, both in what Moritz was saying of transparency and visibility of information and decision making, but also openness to participation, like what Becca mentioned as, you know, what can you do that is not an all or nothing kind of ask. And you know, I was thinking of an example of a project that I've been supporting called SafeCast, which isn't in nuclear arms, but it's around radiation and citizen science. And you know, that was incubated right in my backyard at the LA Hackerspace. And when you get hackers enlisted in a project that there is a technology, but also a technology solution, but also a way of mobilizing volunteer participation in an expansive, open, and transparent way. And I think part of the success of that project is not only that it creates an avenue for people to be creative, to innovate, to hack together around a social purpose, but also the fact that it's tied to this big, open, transparent data set, right? So it tells a story in a language that young people understand, which is about the aggregation of network data. And that's a very compelling story. It enlists people at all different levels, both the technology innovators, but also the people who are in it for the cause. And I think it's that kind of storytelling, the storytelling that incites innovation, but also tells the story of what the collective participation is, how people can make a difference, how you can plug into a bigger movement. What are the stakes and what is the story? And radiation is really easy for people to understand because it's scary, and you know, there is already a compelling story there, but there have been really successful models of stories that are kind of challenging, like Invisible Children is another example that some of my colleagues in the Youth and Participatory Politics Network have studied at length, because that's, you know, it mobilized a lot of US youth, but it's about problems in a country far, far away, and you'd think it would be hard to enlist engagement in that kind of a story. And you know, we can debate the finer points of how well that was framed or what if it was the right social mobilization. But I think the success of the storytelling and the ability to, what Henry Jenkins calls, develop a content world that people understand and are motivated on, is a really good example of that. And if you look at other examples of you know, social causes that have mobilized that more collective participation, I think this aspect of storytelling, of enlisting people into the imagination of what the bigger picture is incredibly important. And I think the story around nuclear security still feels like it's a pretty kind of elite-driven, institutionalized, like, where do I fit into it? I have to dedicate my life to this kind of story, it sounds like.
Yeah, so there are a couple of folks who have virtually been raising their hands here on this. So let me come around to Becca first. I think you were first, and then Moritz and Susanna.
Great, thanks so much. So I love Mimi's point about kind of storytelling and how do we use that as a concept. And I think one of the challenges that we have in the nuclear space is that you know, I think you can think about this issue in two ways. You can think about it as a positive or a negative. And in terms of the positives, I think we struggle to kind of figure out how do you make this an issue that you're working towards something very positive. And we've talked about those kind of engineering initiatives, and I'm not going to pretend for a second that I am competent to speak on that. I'm sure others around the table will have far more to say about that. But on the negative side, and this tends to be how we talk about nuclear issues, is a very, you know, large-scale Armageddon-style risk. And I think that turns people off engaging, because they say either I can't think about something where you're talking about the end of the world, or they say I can think about it, but I don't really want to think about it. That's not how I want to spend my days. And actually what we neglect are those day-to-day impacts that our nuclear policies have. And this is just coming back to the point that I mentioned earlier about kind of connecting the nuclear debate with other issues. I think that's really underexplored. And, you know, we tend to have full nuclear roles in the nuclear community, whereas we've already talked about, you talk about nuclear day in, day out, and actually what there aren't are those connections, roles that kind of cover global policy more broadly and think about not just how does nuclear impact topical issues, Iran, Russia, North Korea, but how does it impact other challenges on the global agenda. And that's something that I think the storytelling piece could be really interesting to think about. And just one other point, if I may, which kind of draws from the drivers, we kind of tried to explore why do people get interested in specific issues? And these were actually difficult questions for people to answer in our focus group discussions. But some patterns did come out. And interestingly, the kind of influence of early experience came quite high on the list. So people said, look, I started hearing about X issue when I was at school, when I was in high school, and I've carried that over to my university studies. It's kind of been a part of my discourse. And I don't think that's really the case for nuclear issues. The second is personal connection and relevance. So people said, I get involved in things if I feel like somebody I know or if I have been personally impacted by it. And again, it's very hard to think about nuclear in that way. And then the question around clear goals and impact we've talked about. But the final point is on balance. So I think certainly from the groups we talked to, people felt that in the nuclear debate, you kind of have to pick a side, and the information you get is it's either one way or the other. You know, you're either pro or anti, and there isn't really much out there that says, here's a really balanced discussion about this. And maybe that is just the nature of advocacy, or, you know, I'm sure you would find the same in the climate field, for example, but I think there probably is a bit more nuance to it on some of these other issues that people respond to in a different way.
So I'm interested in a theme that I hear running through this, which is the need for people to have the tools that let them figure out what story they want to be a part of in relation to nuclear issues, versus being particularly persuaded on one side or the other of the conversation. And several of you have mentioned the idea that it's important to attach nuclear issues to something else that millennials, young adults care about. So I'd love to hear any specifics that people have in mind, attached to what issues. Climate change certainly comes to mind, but what other issues do we have a sense of what those are that we should be connecting with? Becca, do you want to check in? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think we could probably have a fairly superficial conversation about that right now, but I think that's actually something we need to dig into in a really meaningful way. You know, I could list off a whole range of things which I would count as collaborative challenges that potentially are nuclear postures inhibit us from actually achieving to our maximum potential, ranging from international development to global economic stability to straight defense to international relations. But actually, I think what would be more useful would be to actually dig into that in a really meaningful way. And I don't think that's been done yet.
Fair enough. Moritz, you were next, I think, with your hand up.
I think to your last question, what stories? First, shortly, I think the word that I haven't heard on this roundtable is the word peace, actually. Even if it sounds like the word that was used in the 70s by people, it still, at least for me, it is attractive to work for global peace or for a peace issue, actually, which I can also tell other people. So if they ask me, what are you doing? Disarming nuclear weapons, I say, look, I'm working for a peace cause. So that is appealing, also next to job opportunities and other options. And that also works coming to different fields. So what I tried and did some months ago was going to the hacker culture. I'm not part of it. So I program, that is part of my job as a physicist, but I would not consider myself a hacker in a meaningful sense. I experienced at this conference where I gave a talk on disarmament hacks that a black t-shirt that I was wearing by accident was actually a good choice because everybody else was wearing one. So I was not experiencing, or I was not experienced enough, I was not knowing what I was going into, but I spoke to many people about what could be actual hacks in disarmament, and the thing that I talked about, Safecast actually was one of them. Safecast is not a nuclear disarmament device, but a nuclear safety thing that people made for the people in Japan when they had this big nuclear accident to help them, and it motivated people. So crowdsourced attempts could actually be disarmament hacks. Other things could be really technical devices. For example, we talk about information barriers to be specifically used to disarm warheads or to verify that there is actually a warhead existing without revealing knowledge to others. This could be a perfect device where you would need hackers because you want to avoid that other people, or that one state fools the other state. This is a typical attempt in a typical task in computer science. You want to make sure that your message get from A to B without somebody else reading it or actually changing it. That's the same for an information barrier. And there's also hacking on social issues. For example, the disarmament process. So one example I found today was a Harvard initiative which is called Hacking iCorruption. So they actually apply the hacker idea to corruption, which is not a nuclear issue, but the same could be hacking nuclear security or hacking nuclear safety. And I think it is interesting to see it as a creative way to get to new ideas. And just a last theme that fits into this, many people also talk about virtual realities for nuclear safety, and they would use it for training, they would use it for testing actually, policies, treaties, negotiations. And these, I think, could be a good spot where game developers could come in, or people interested in games. I don't know if that's something, Susanna, you had done, or you could imagine your group of people doing.
Yeah, absolutely, Moritz. I mean, I think VR, virtual reality, is a wonderful tool to explore some of these issues. There's actually quite a movement in that space to develop empathy games using VR, because it is a great for those of you who might not be familiar with VR, so it's virtual reality with the headsets. Oculus is one of the first in the space, and now certainly Google has Google Cardboard, and there are other devices that you can use. But the fact that you can put yourself in a situation and perhaps experience it in a more personal level, and I think that is one of the areas that are being researched right now. Dr. Adam Ghazali is doing that at his lab, and there are a number of other labs that they are exploring social issues that can be demonstrated through VR. Now, whether it's a game or it's a film, that's something that people are debating. But the idea that that a story is being told and you are able to participate in that story and you're able to change the narrative is a way that that I think is really meaningful. And one of the reasons why games is an interesting medium to explore on these issues. We were talking about storytelling earlier as a way to not only excite the next generation on these issues, but personalize it. And that's the background actually that I come from. Before I started working in games, I worked with documentary filmmakers and narrative filmmakers around projects around issues, and that's an interesting, and it certainly is a very powerful tool. It made me think about something I heard that the NSF said as they are dealing with very similar issues of getting young people to want to enter into STEM-related careers, about bringing the cameras into their labs and telling stories that happen within that what might be presumably considered closed doors, and it may be difficult to do in these around this subject area. And certainly when we talk about openness and transparency, I think that will humanize this sector and make it, I think, could be a pathway to get young people to see themselves in some of these stories and how they can actually make a difference. Another example I want to talk about in terms of kind of aggregating big data is it was a really fun experiment in a game that is existing right now, which is called Fold It. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, but it basically is it's a game where you are folding proteins, and it started off as a bit of an experiment. And what's happened since then is that thousands of people have played this game. That has ultimately unlocked the structure of an enzyme that the scientific community hasn't been able to solve in over a decade. And the data that came out of that is so meaningful. They've had a couple of reports in science magazines, including Nature. But that is a fantastic example of people who are who may not feel like they can have an impact and might be an anonymous voice or a face, can collectively join in a mass program and effectively have some kind of a result and impact. And I do think there's a lot of power to that kind of experience that that could perhaps be designed around these issues as well.
So there is so much that I want to dig into here, and I know just in the interest of time that we have to shift gears. But I know there are things that you all are thinking about right now that you'll have an opportunity to get back into the conversation here in the next few minutes. Ewan, I know you have a thought that relates to Susanna's observations here, and then I have a question for you, Ewan. So go right ahead.
Right. Well, I look forward to the trick question. So taking what Susanna said, I just want to try and kind of resteer the conversation. So we've all been trying to connect it about rebranding nuclear weapons to make it more attractive, attaching it to various other issues, which I think is probably the right answer. But just one similar point is just nuclear weapons have a very strong brand already, and it's said with it's got a Cold War hat on, which is very much no news is good news in terms of averting war, which is the promotion of peace, as was mentioned earlier. So to take an idea of that kind of works in the game fashion, why not bring an old diplomat down, kind of enforce this idea of them being a kind of hero figure, and use kind of technology. Bring a small truck to each college campus that has lots of computer screens and flashing lights and things, and make it, pick a small group of students and say, okay, this is a situation room, like the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the White House or someone would pledge, and say, okay, let's take today, let's not take the Cold War, let's say there's a rogue state, there's a rogue actor, we don't know who they are, or we don't know if there's a nuclear accident or whatnot. Let's run through a scenario, let's try and avert, global Armageddon. And at the end of that scenario is when the diplomat could kind of intervene and say, look how close it came just because, some rogue state actually, dropped a spanner down a silo shaft and hit a nuclear missile. And then they say, okay, think about how easy it is to go from, relative peace, just a normal day, to kind of the brink of Armageddon. Let's now kind of, let's excite students about this. Let's say, this is why we need to push disarmament, because even those in the height of power in the White House, they have so little information available to them in the real world as to whether there is the kickoff of the Third World War or not. So I guess what I'm trying to say is run these kind of small game scenarios to really highlight to students just how easy it is to go to the brink, and then say, reinforce the idea, look, if you're interested in nuclear disarmament, here is a follow-up internship with such and such public servant sector. It would also help to compensate them because the private sector is far more enticing in that fashion. But really just kind of connect this idea of disaster is so easily had, it can be averted, get involved, and kind of make those 3 steps. And I think if you use kind of Susanna's idea of gaming and kind of virtual reality, I think that could make it more clear to them.
So Ewan, let me turn that on its head and ask you this: why not do a hackathon on college campuses and have students like you create the experiences?
Well, it probably would be best if it wasn't me, because I'm completely useless with computers. But I think generally, yes, it's a fantastic idea. And I really like the idea that was made earlier by our physicist friends, in that, hacking culture in terms of promoting nuclear safeguards, I think that's a fantastic idea. So I think my answer is yes. It's pure and simple yes. Try it out. I think it would work great, and I think it would help steer these students who are interested in hacking onto another subject, because they can still hack with it. So yes. Yeah.
I feel sure that we can find plenty of people to work on the computer piece with you. So let me turn the page now for the last main section of the conversation that we want to have today, which is to get to some concrete ideas. As you all know, N-Square was set up by our funders to be a catalyst for new voices and new ideas. And so I'm curious now, based on the conversation we've been having, if I were to put you in a fictional world now where resources were no issue at all, the question is, who would you target to bring to the nuclear security field, and what could we possibly do to entice them? So I'm going to go first, Ewan, I think you actually began to answer this question already, so I'm going to go to Anna next. And ask you, Anna, who would you target to bring to the field, and what could we possibly do to entice them?
So my opinion will resonate with what Becca said earlier, that there are a few things that influence how you bring people in, and I'm going to go in reverse from what Becca said. And first is a balance, and I think lack of balance when it comes to nuclear issue plays a big role in attracting people. You take sides with nuclear. And once people are in, they're really in. And the other 2 things are personal connection and then early experience. And I think early experience should not be underestimated. One of the things that we found here in nuclear engineering department is bring people early, and I'm talking about Boy Scouts, anywhere between age of 12 to 17, actually showing them what nuclear is all about means that we have a good chance to get them as undergraduate students in the future. Now, this is before resources are not an issue, right? Resources are a big issue when it comes to education. I think that's a big problem with some of the approaches U.S. education system has taken. And one of them is the state colleges while being affordable, open to the state students only. So I'll give you a concrete example here. Georgia Tech a few years ago opened what we called academic common market. So students from the southern states that did not have nuclear engineering programs were able to enroll at Georgia Tech at the in-state tuition level. So we had the largest enrollment in years because of the academic common market. It stopped in 2013. So we saw a drop of enrollment for undergraduate from 60 students every year, now down to 25, 30 students. So resources are a big issue, and perhaps taking steps and changing how we treat the undergraduate education could be a first one we take. The other one is the STEM education and targeting high schools. I think that's an extremely important point here. Making the students aware early on what nuclear is about. You know what we hear when we tell people with nuclear engineers? Oh, you must be a genius. No, we just took that as a career path and we went with it, despite of, you know, what you might attach as a sticker to this career. And in fact, we have a lot of engineering students that transfer from, say, mechanical or even chemical engineering to nuclear once they learn more about the field. So one thing that we do is make nuclear more interdisciplinary. So at least in my group, we work with robotics, we work with chemistry, with mechanical engineering, we work with physics students. To give you concrete examples, how is nuclear applied to robotics? We work on robots that could survive high radiation environments in both accident scenarios, but also in non-proliferation, discovering illicit activities when you can't really send a human to. Chemistry, we focus on nuclear forensics, so we have to work with the chemistry department. Physics, anti-neutrino detectors, using them for treaty, using anti-neutrino particles to understand whether something's going on in the world in terms of nuclear testing. So you see that nuclear is not as narrow-minded as it's usually perceived, and attracting students from other departments, we raised the issue and awareness of nuclear weapons and nuclear proliferation. I'm sorry, my voice is going down again, so I'm going to stop here.
That's great. You got us into a great place, and actually, I'm gonna call on Mimi to comment on this a little bit, to go deeper on what you've just raised, Anna, which is what are the means by which we might capture the interest and imagination, well, let's say in grades 8 through 12 in the United States. How would we actually go about that, given the evolution of the digital classroom?
Well, is it okay if I just jump in?
Sure, Susanna, we'll go to you, and then we'll go to Mimi.
Well, we have a couple of programs that we've been working with schools. I mean, there are a number of schools that are actively actually teaching game design in the classrooms as part of a computer science program or running after-school programs. And we actually have, during a pilot in New York City around social issue games and challenging middle and high school students to think about how designing games can actually cause people to think and potentially have an impact. And we whether we want to include one on nuclear issues, you know, we should actually talk about that because it's a great way to engage kids not only on developing amazing skills that are involved in game design in terms of system thinking and another 21st century, you know, kind of skill sets, but also around thinking about how these issues. It's a great pathway, a gateway, let's say, into issues in a fun and engaging way that doesn't require a lot of commitment, but also gives them an opportunity to dig into an issue like this through an activity that they would find interesting. So it's almost like the backdoor approach. But I think programs like that, where you can fold in, talk about cross-disciplinary, I think that really is the key to engaging kids, particularly in the digital space around this. I'd be curious what Mimi has to say.
Yeah, I definitely like the ideas that have been percolating around games that Susanna and Yuan have mentioned. And, you know, there are games like the Redistricting game or iCivics and so on that I think have done a really good job of using sort of role-playing and simulation and so on to have that more hands-on experience with a complex issue. I think there's also some pretty simple things that could be done on just videos and the storytelling piece, sort of going back to what Moritz was saying. It's like to connect it to stuff that that are deeply felt issues. So peace is a great one, but justice is also a really important one that I think could be tied to these issues. And I think the environmental movement has done a really good job, or the alternative food movement, right, of tying these fairly abstract kind of industrial sorts of issues into a story that's really compelling. So if you probably have seen the Story of Stuff project. That's a really good example. It just started with a video and it's become a movement, right? So Invisible Children is also just an example. It's like it was a video that catalyzed these movements. If you and then I don't know if people have seen the video. If you can Google tax dollars at war. There's just a series of videos that have done really good job of capturing a very complex and abstract issue in a way that just gets people riled. So I remember my daughter, and because of the whole shareable media ecosystem we live in now, like I remember when my daughter was in middle school, she just came home one day and she plopped her laptop right in the middle of our kitchen table and said, "You just have to watch this." And this was Story of Stuff. And because these videos are circulatable, like just packaging things in media forms that are spreadable, that kids can share with other kids, but also parents can access from home. Teachers love this stuff because they're hungry for things, issues that are going to engage kids. And I think some of the social justice oriented videos, I think the environmental videos are really, really good examples of, these are complex arguments that are being packaged in these videos, and you start somewhere and then you kind of see how the community engages that, and you don't even have to prescribe the solutions necessarily, but sort of it creates an opening for a conversation. And I think that's just as a place to start, something that just hearing from all of you about all the different touch points of what I, as a non-specialist, thought of as a very sort of inaccessible and abstract area, seems to me to indicate that there are some good stories to be told.
That's great. I dropped off for just a quick second, but Moritz, I think we were going to go to you next. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about any of the last few comments or my original question about who you would target to bring into the sector and what you think we would have to do to get them.
Come back to your question. Looking at who to target, basically it's everyone. That's part of the story. There's no limited group of people of a specific knowledge that we need. We would need artists, we would need technicians, we would need policy people, we would need people from all kinds of backgrounds, but they need to be interested in the issue and they need to work together. They need to be open to work together. How to get them? It's difficult, but I think one piece that could be actually managed is to give them an opportunity to be involved part-time, kind of like an amateurish involvement, instead of this is your career path, this is your job that you need to focus on, this is what you could learn. Just have them, a way where they could spend some time and leave a mark and then go back to what they usually do, and also give them a chance to have their work actually contributed to them. So I always come back to writing computer code, but that's what I know of. But there's ways, where people actually can work together on the same file, and you can actually see who did which part. And if you would have something like this to work on nuclear problems, that would be interesting because people could just spend Sunday afternoon working on nuclear disarmament and then go back and do whatever they did before.
Yeah, okay, that is a really helpful perspective. Becca, I think we'd like to hear from you, and then Carl, we're going to come to you in just a moment to help us think aloud about some of the things we heard here today and what we'll take away with us. So Becca.
Sure. I mean, I would really just echo Moritz's point that, you know, I think we tend in the nuclear field at the moment to focus very much on policymakers and experts, and that only gives you one type of discussion. And you know, we need to be thinking about how do you broaden this out to include journalist majors and people who want to be activists. People who are interested in completely different fields on you know, international banking. What kind of actions specifically can they take to participate in this discussion? And you know, that's probably not particularly helpful, because saying we just need to talk to everybody, you know, we need to find a way to kind of channel that in. But I think the point is that there are different audiences that we're trying to engage with, and they will respond to different things. So for example, if you were talking about engaging emerging policymakers, one of the messages that we got across loud and clear was, don't try and talk to us through the celebrity channel, because we ain't interested. But you know, if you're actually talking about young people who are potentially not getting engaged in the policy field, the celebrity track might be a way of engaging them. So, I mean, I know we're talking specifically about careers here, but I think that message rings true, that there are different ways that you would engage journalists and authors that are different from engineers, that are different from people who want to be involved in the gaming community, that is again different from the policymakers. And actually understanding those and not kind of putting our own preconceived notions of how you go about doing that, finding ways to actually engage in conversations with those communities is a really important step in that process.
Erica, I think you're muted.
I am no longer muted. So Becca, thanks for that. And yes, it is on one hand like looking for a needle in a haystack to say that we need to be targeting everybody. On the other hand, it's probably a message that the field can't hear often enough. And I know that when N-Square was started, it was partly so that we could have a very broad remit, and we could talk to as many different types of people as possible, and you can trust that we are combing through all of these videos and every conversation we've been having along the way, looking for those ideas that might be a glimmer of something that we can fund, might be something that we can pursue to see how much we can learn from it. So thank you all in this conversation for all of the ideas. Whether you feel like you're an expert or not, you've brought something enormously important to the table. And so with that, I'd like to hand it over to you, Carl, to help us make sense of what we've been hearing today.
Thanks. I don't know how much sense I'm going to make, but I'll do my best. You know, I think that we heard today about a few key barriers that we face, and also a number of really good solutions. So I've been jotting down notes. I'm going to go through what I see as basically 3 major categories of barriers. And I'd be interested in your response, see if I got them right, if there might be some that I'm missing. But the main 3 categories I see, one relates to structure of the field in terms of the careers, in terms of the secrecy. So the sort of structural impediments to having people join. The second relates to personal connection. This issue, it's very difficult to make a personal connection to the nuclear issue in the way it is to some other issues. And the third is a question of efficacy. If people are going to get involved in something, they want to feel like they can make a difference. And I don't think we've done a good job of showing people that they can make a difference within this field. So let me take structural first. I think that in terms of careers, we've heard that having a career in the nuclear space, there are high barriers to entry. You can't come and go. Generally, the rewards come later in your career, so you have to spend a lot of time doing less interesting things before you get to do more interesting things. And how do you compete with fields where you can be building really cool stuff as a 26-year-old versus those where you've got to sort of pay your dues up front? And, you know, it is a shrinking field. There aren't too many jobs. So for a young person to decide, I'm going to focus on something that's a relatively niche field without a lot of jobs where I've got to pay my dues, that's a structural impediment that we face. Are we going to be able to overcome that? I'm thinking about ways that foundations and NGOs can do that. One might be to have some kind of time-delimited mid-career fellows or early career fellows where you say, I'm going to come in, I'm going to do 2 years at this organization, I have a specific remit, and I'm going to do interesting stuff from the start. And then after 2 years, there's no obligation I stay. I have something that's really appealing on my resume. I can go out and do something else. And maybe I'll come back, maybe I won't. But finding ways to create those type of positions rather than the traditional entry-level positions, I think is something we really need to think about. There are a few of them out there, but not enough. A second one is driving openness. You know, Moritz talked a little bit about the challenges of working on something in such a closed space where you can't share and collaborate. Are there ways, you know, with the understanding there are some things that are going to be secret, there's some things that are going to be classified, but are there ways to work on some of these problems in a more open way? And the third, I would say, is are there ways we can help people contribute to the field without being in it? So people from parallel spheres, ways to bring them in and harness their knowledge without an expectation that this is going to be a career for them, but that they're essentially advisors. And I think we need to think about ways to do that. So those are some of the structural impediments and some of the solutions that I was thinking of and how to address them. The second one is this issue of personal connection, and we spent a lot of time talking about this. You know, people don't have an affinity with nuclear issues, or they don't identify with them. And it's an abstract issue. It's scary. It's something you don't really want to think about, and it's hard to relate to. And I know this because I've had many conversations over Thanksgiving dinner or at cocktail parties, and you know, people often shut down when you bring up this topic. Other people are really interested in it, so it's interesting to find out which type of people respond in which way. But I think that one thing we heard about is the need to connect to existing issues and experiences, existing concerns about international equity, or maybe a fear of terrorism and what nuclear terrorism would mean, environmental issues and how the nuclear power problem relates to environment and climate change. There might be different on-roads there to connect to things that people already care about. But we need to think through that in a serious way, because trying to make superficial connections is not going to work. A second one is in terms of early experiences. We heard again and again that oftentimes the reason people devote themselves to something or get involved in something is because they had an experience at an early age. So are there ways to create vivid early experiences for people? Gaming and virtual reality might be a part of that. And also finding ways to tell the story in a more compelling way. Which we heard a little bit about shareable content and how that's a way to make this issue more personal and make a connection to it. And also about vivid immersive experiences. I like Ewan's idea of having a sort of a rolling experience that would go from college town to college town and allow people to interact in a very vivid way with the challenges that we face. And it's interesting because it actually echoes a very similar set of conversations we're having within N-Square about how to do that. So I think that we have some really good materials to work with on how to create this personal connection, but it's hard to do, and it doesn't lend itself to that type of personal connection. Again, I'm a little bit heartened by the fact that we don't need tens of thousands of people to throw themselves behind this. You know, when we're talking about drawing in new talent, you know, the number of new talented people we need to bring in is in the hundreds, I would say. So finding those people is key. So the third major impediment that I saw, the barrier, is efficacy. So if you have someone who's thinking about working on nuclear issues versus some other issue, like maybe clean tech, right? If I enter now, what can I do in this space? Do I see any chance of progress? You know, Anna talked about how no one wants to sit around and design paper reactors that never get built. Moritz talked about no one wants to design verification systems that are never going to be in use. And in some other fields, things move more quickly, and you can see in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years, the fruits of your labor. And that's really exciting. So I think that there are some real challenges here that we just can't get around. International diplomacy moves slowly. And all of these efforts tend to move rather slowly. But at the same time, I think we can highlight some of the areas in which individuals have had a profound effect on the course of history and on the shape of our security. You look back to the 80s and some of the citizen science exchanges and how they played a fundamental role in bringing the Cold War to a close and avoiding nuclear crises. If you look at the work that was done in the early 90s in cooperative threat reduction, and the heroes like Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar, who pioneered new approaches to cooperating between the US and Russia that made us fundamentally safer. But I think there are other stories too that have come since then about people taking action to reduce the risk of nuclear catastrophe. And I think we need to do a better job of telling those stories, both in the small and in the large. You know, not every, you know, you can show personal efficacy without saving the world, right? And we need to do a better job of telling some of those stories, and tying it to this heroic narrative that is in some of the other fields that we see that really draws people in. So those are some of my thoughts. I missed a lot of stuff there, but I'm interested in hearing people's responses to that.
Good. I think we have just a minute or so. That was a terrific summary. Thank you for that, Carl. And I should take this moment just to say thank you again, Carl, for your support of the work that we're doing, the fact that we're even in this conversation today, and to all of the other funders as well. We need to wrap up here very quickly, so let me just see if there are any last responses to what Carl laid out here. I think... Yeah, Pete.
I will say one thing. As the founder of Reinventors, we've done literally dozens and dozens and dozens of these roundtables. And I will say, Carl, this is not, I'm not fawning on you. That's the most impressive real-time synthesis in 90 minutes I think I've ever seen done. Honestly, that usually happens, takes a couple days to pull that thing together, usually. And we will turn this together, by the way, into videos, written blog posts, all kinds of a package will be done by the end of the week. But it'll take us the rest of the week to do it. And Carl did it in about one 90-minute session. Quite impressive, I will say. But I do think we have to kind of wrap it up.
So too. Thank you. You go ahead and take us out, and thank you again, everybody.
No, it was really a terrific roundtable, the whole thing, and thanks so much to everyone on the panel here, on the roundtable, and those watching. And we will, like I say, we'll do a 10-minute version, kind of recap of this, the best ideas. We'll do a short social media version, a less than 2-minute kind of viral version, and we'll do write-ups in. And also, we will take some of the feedback we got through social media. So anyhow, thank you very much, and we've got 2 more roundtables coming on.